I believed the lie because it came from my own child. When he told me the family dinner was canceled, I did not argue or question him. I stayed home, set my phone down, and accepted the quiet like I always did. 2 hours later, I stood on a sidewalk I was never meant to be on and watched through a restaurant window as laughter filled a table where my seat had never existed. That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to change everything I thought I knew about love, trust, and what silence truly costs. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 64 years old, widowed, retired, and I live alone in a small brick house on a quiet street in Savannah, Georgia. The house sits a few blocks from the river, close enough that on humid evenings I can smell the water when the wind shifts. I have lived here for almost 20 years, long enough that the floors creak in familiar places and the neighbors no longer knock before calling out my name. My husband, Thomas, died 4 years ago after a sudden stroke. One day he was arguing with me about whether the azaleas needed trimming, and the next day I was standing in a hospital hallway signing papers I barely understood. When he passed, the noise of my life went with him. The house did not change, but everything inside it felt hollow, like sound echoing in an empty room. Before I retired, I worked as an accountant for a regional transportation company. I stayed there for over 3 decades, balancing ledgers, reviewing payroll, and making sure numbers lined up the way they were supposed to. I was never flashy at my job, but I was dependable. I believed in order, in preparation, in doing things the right way, even when no one was watching. Those habits stayed with me long after I stopped working. Retirement did not feel like freedom the way people said it would. It felt more like learning how to fill time that used to belong to someone else. My days settled into a predictable rhythm. I woke early, made coffee, read the local paper from front to back. On Sundays, I attended church and sat in the same pew I had shared with my husband for years. During the week, I tended my small garden and met friends for lunch, women my age who also knew what it was like to lose a spouse and quietly rebuild a life around that absence. After Thomas died, my world narrowed until it centered almost entirely on my son. Andrew is my only child. He is 39 years old and lives in Charleston, South Carolina, about 2 hours north of me. He works in finance, wears tailored suits, and talks about markets and forecasts in a way that still feels foreign to me. He is married to Melissa, a woman from a well-established family, and from the outside their life looks solid and impressive. I have always been proud of him. I raised him to work hard, to aim high, and to build something better than what we had. I told myself that the distance between us was practical, not emotional. Andrew was busy. His job demanded long hours. His life was full. I understood that. Or, at least, I told myself I did. When days passed without a call, I reminded myself that successful people were always in demand. When texts came back short and polite instead of warm, I assumed it was stress. I was almost always the one who reached out first. I asked about his work, his home, his plans. I made sure never to sound needy. I did not want to be the kind of mother who clung too tightly or made her child feel guilty for moving on. I believed that love meant stepping back when necessary. What I did not admit, even to myself, was how much I relied on those brief conversations to feel anchored. After my husband died, Andrew became the proof that my life still had purpose. As long as he needed me, even a little, I felt useful. I thought my life was simple, steady, and intact. I believed I understood my place in it. I did not yet know how fragile that belief was, or how quickly it would begin to unravel. If you're still watching and starting to sense that something feels off beneath the surface, comment number 1 below, so I know you're with me. What happens next is the first crack in a story I never thought would break. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. The day Andrew called felt ordinary in every possible way. I had spent the morning doing laundry, folding shirts the way I always had, even though no one but me would see them. By early afternoon, the heat had settled in, thick and slow, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of iced tea, watching the light shift across the floor. When my phone rang, I assumed it was a reminder from the pharmacy or one of my church friends checking in. It was Andrew. He did not usually call in the middle of the day, so I straightened in my chair, already smiling before I answered. His voice sounded rushed, but not upset. He told me he would not be able to make it down for dinner that weekend after all. The reservation had been canceled, he said. Something about an electrical problem at the restaurant. It was not a big deal. These things happened. I told him I understood, and I meant it. Still, I felt the familiar disappointment settle quietly in my chest. I had already planned the weekend around that dinner. I had thought about what to wear, what questions I would ask, how long I might get to sit across from my son and feel included in his life again. I did not say any of that. I never did. There was a pause on the line, just long enough for me to sense that the call was not over. Andrew cleared his throat and shifted the conversation, explaining that he was dealing with a short-term financial issue. An investment had not cleared when he expected it to. Nothing serious, just inconvenient timing. He needed $2,000 to bridge the gap for a few weeks. I listened without interrupting. I did not ask what kind of investment it was or why it could not wait. I had learned over the years that questions sometimes sounded like doubt, and doubt sounded like judgment. I did not want him to think I doubted him. I told him I could help. After we hung up, I logged into my bank account and transferred the money. The process took less than a minute. I had done it enough times that my fingers moved automatically. When the confirmation screen appeared, I felt a small sense of relief, the kind that comes from fixing a problem quickly. Helping him made me feel useful. It reminded me that I still had a role to play. Later that evening, the house felt quieter than usual. I reheated leftovers for dinner and ate alone at the counter. Dang, I tried to tell myself that the canceled dinner was just a scheduling issue, nothing more. People with busy lives made plans that changed. I had raised Andrew to prioritize his responsibilities. I should have been proud of that. And yet, something did not sit right. It was not the money. I had savings, and I was careful. I could afford to help my son. What lingered was the tone of the conversation, the way Andrew had moved quickly past the cancellation, the way he had not sounded disappointed at all. I replayed the call in my head, searching for warmth I might have missed. I told myself I was being overly sensitive. Loneliness had a way of sharpening small things into imagined slights. I reminded myself that Andrew had always been practical, not sentimental. That was not a flaw. It was just who he was. Before bed, I checked my phone one more time, half expecting a follow-up message. There was nothing. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and turned off the light. As I lay there in the dark, I thought about the dinner that was not going to happen and the money that was already gone. I told myself it was all normal, that trust did not require constant proof. Still, the unease lingered, quiet but persistent, like a question I was not yet ready to ask. If you're still here and beginning to wonder whether this was really just a misunderstanding, Comment number 2 below to let me know you're paying attention, because the next moment changes suspicion into something far more painful. Let's move on to chapter 3. I did not tell Andrew I was coming to Charleston. The trip was not planned around him at all. An old friend from my accounting days had passed away, and the service was scheduled for a Thursday morning. I drove up alone the night before, following the familiar stretch of highway with the radio turned low, letting my thoughts wander the way they always did on long drives. There was a strange comfort in being on the road by myself, untethered from expectations. After the service, I returned to my hotel earlier than I expected. The room felt too quiet, so I went out for a walk as dusk settled over the city. Charleston has a way of glowing at night, the streets softened by warm lights and slow-moving people who look like they have nowhere urgent to be. I told myself I was just stretching my legs, giving myself something to do until bedtime. I did not realize where I was until I was already there. The restaurant Andrew had mentioned was on a busy corner downtown, its windows tall and bright, the inside clearly visible from the sidewalk. I slowed without meaning to, my attention caught by movement and sound behind the glass. Then I saw him. Andrew was seated near the center of the room, his profile unmistakable. He was leaning back in his chair, one arm draped casually along the table. Across from him sat Melissa, polished and composed, and around them were her parents and a few relatives I recognized from past holidays. The table was set with wine glasses and shared plates. Everyone was laughing, engaged, present. I stopped walking. For a moment, I told myself I must be mistaken. Maybe this was a different restaurant. Maybe this was a different night. But the sign above the door matched the name Andrew had given me, and the sight in front of me did not waver. This was the dinner he had said was canceled. I stood there longer than I should have. My heart began to pound, not sharply, but heavily, as if it were trying to press against my ribs. My hands felt cold despite the warm evening air. I noticed small details I would not have otherwise paid attention to, the way Andrew tilted his glass when he spoke, the ease in his smile, the way the others leaned toward him as he talked. There was no empty seat. That realization landed slowly, but firmly. This was not a last-minute substitution or a changed plan. This was a complete gathering, intact without me. I was not late. I was not forgotten. I was simply not included. No one inside looked toward the window. No one scanned the sidewalk or paused mid-conversation. I was invisible, standing just beyond the glass, watching a version of my son that did not require me. I waited for the sting to turn into something clearer, anger perhaps, or grief, but instead there was a hollow confusion. I could not reconcile the image in front of me with the conversation we had just days earlier. The words he used, the calm way he had told me the dinner was off, replayed in my mind with unsettling clarity. I did not go inside. I did not raise my phone to take a picture or make a call. I stayed where I was, absorbing the scene until I felt myself start to tremble. When I finally turned away, it was not out of dignity or restraint. It was because I could no longer stand there pretending this was an accident. I walked back toward my hotel slowly, each step heavier than the last. My thoughts were scattered, refusing to form a clean explanation. I knew only one thing for certain. Whatever I thought I understood about my place in my son's life was no longer accurate, and this could not be explained away as a simple misunderstanding. If you're still watching, and your heart tightened during that scene, comment number 3 so I know you felt it too. What I discovered next forced me to stop looking away. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. I woke up early the next morning in my hotel room, long before the alarm I had set the night before. I had barely slept. My body felt tired, but my mind would not slow down. The image of Andrew at that table kept replaying, uninvited and unannounced, like a scene that refused to end. I lay still for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, trying to convince myself that what I had seen did not mean what it seemed to mean. I did not call my son. I did not send a message asking for an explanation. I knew myself well enough to understand that if I spoke to him too soon, I would accept whatever answer he gave me, simply because it would be easier than sitting with uncertainty. So I chose silence instead. On the drive back to Savannah later that morning, the highway stretched ahead of me in a straight, unremarkable line. I let my thoughts move backward through time, replaying conversations I had not questioned before. I remembered how often Andrew mentioned financial stress right after family gatherings. I remembered how his requests were always framed as temporary, always urgent, and always followed by reassurance that everything was under control. At the time, it had all sounded reasonable. When I got home, I unpacked slowly and put the kettle on, following the familiar steps of my routine as if they might steady me. Then I sat at the desk in the corner of my living room and opened my laptop. I logged into my bank account with the same password I had used for years and began scrolling. At first, I told myself I was only checking the most recent transfer, but one transaction led to another, and soon I was moving further back, month by month, year by year. I opened a notebook and started writing down dates and amounts. My handwriting was neat, deliberate, the way it had always been when I worked. Numbers had always made sense to me. They told the truth when people did not. As the list grew longer, my chest tightened. The totals were larger than I remembered. Some transfers were for small amounts, others were not. Each one came with a reason I could recall clearly: an investment delay, a short-term loan, a cash flow issue. I had believed every explanation because I wanted to believe my son was still the person I had raised. I checked for repayments, even though I already suspected the answer. There were none, not a single transfer in the opposite direction. Seeing it laid out so plainly unsettled me more than the dinner ever had. This was not a moment. This was a pattern. I thought about closing the computer and walking away, but instead I picked up the phone and called a friend from my working years, a woman who had spent decades in banking. I did not tell her everything. I simply asked what she would do if she wanted to understand her finances better. She advised me to look at the full picture before drawing conclusions. After the call, I sat quietly for a long time, staring at the notebook on my desk. I was not ready to label what I was uncovering. Words like betrayal and deception felt too heavy, too final. I still wanted there to be an explanation that preserved the version of my son I held on to. But something had shifted. I could feel it. The instinct to protect Andrew at all costs was giving way to a need to protect myself. I did not know yet where this path would lead, only that I could not turn back now. Whatever the truth was, I needed to see it clearly, even if it frightened me to do so. If you're still with me and starting to realize this goes much deeper than hurt feelings, comment number 4 below. The next chapter is where doubt ends and the truth finally speaks for itself. Let's continue to chapter 5. I should have gone back to my hotel and packed my bag. That would have been the sensible thing to do. My business in Charleston was finished, and there was nothing keeping me there except a tight feeling in my chest that would not ease. As evening settled in, I found myself walking again, drawn by the same restless energy that had followed me since the night before. I told myself I was only going to clear my head. I did not plan to return to the restaurant. I did not plan to see anyone. And yet, without consciously choosing it, my feet carried me back to the same block, to the same corner where the windows glowed against the darkening street. Inside, the restaurant was busier than before. A group had gathered in one of the private dining rooms toward the back, the door partly open as servers moved in and out. I stepped inside briefly, using the excuse of needing directions to the restroom. The air was warm and filled with the sound of overlapping conversations, the clink of glasses, the low hum of music. As I passed the open doorway, I heard my son's voice. It stopped me in place, not because I was searching for it, but because my body recognized it before my mind did. I stood there, half hidden by a decorative partition, fully intending to move on. Then I heard my name. Andrew was talking about me. He was not angry. That was what surprised me most. His tone was casual, almost amused. He said I was outdated, that I did not understand how money worked anymore, that I worried too much and asked the wrong questions. Someone laughed softly. Another voice commented on how people like me had a hard time adjusting to modern life. I felt the blood drain from my face. Andrew continued, explaining that the money I sent helped him keep things smooth. It allowed him to avoid awkward conversations, to maintain appearances. He spoke as if this were practical, even necessary. There was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of guilt, just certainty. My hands began to shake. I pressed them together, hoping the pressure would steady them. The sounds around me blurred slightly, as if my ears were filling with water. I was aware of my own breathing, shallow and uneven, and of the strange heaviness settling behind my eyes. No one in the room knew I was there. They spoke freely, confidently, assuming distance was protection. I realized then that whatever story Andrew told me was carefully constructed, but this was the version he shared when he believed it could not reach me. I waited for someone to soften it, to offer a different perspective. It did not happen. The comments moved on, drifting toward other topics, leaving his words suspended in the air like something unfinished. But they were finished. They had done their work. In that moment, any remaining doubt fell away. This was not a misunderstanding or a poorly worded explanation. This was how my son saw me, not as a mother who had supported him, but as an inconvenience he managed, a resource he accessed when needed. I did not step into the room. I did not announce myself or demand answers. I turned and walked out, my legs carrying me forward even as my mind lagged behind. Outside, the evening air felt sharp against my skin, and I realized I was trembling openly now. I walked without direction, letting the noise of the city fade into the background. There were no tears yet, only a numb pressure that wrapped around my ribs and made each breath feel deliberate. I understood, with a clarity that hurt, that some things could not be unheard. What I had just listened to had shifted something permanent. Whatever explanation Andrew might offer later would have to compete with the truth I had already received, unfiltered and unguarded. And I knew, even then, that I could never return to the version of myself who believed this was all harmless. I walked for a long time after leaving the restaurant, though I could not tell you where I went. The streets blurred together, lit by storefronts and passing cars, all of it moving around me as if nothing had changed. I did not cry. I did not feel angry in the way people describe anger. What I felt was a hollow quiet, like a room after everyone has left and the door has been closed. When I finally returned to my hotel, I locked the door behind me and stood there in the dark. I did not turn on a single light. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands folded in my lap, aware of the way my fingers trembled slightly. My chest felt heavy, as if something were resting on it, making each breath deliberate. I waited for the shock to pass. It did not. My thoughts kept circling back to Andrew as a child. I saw him at 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework while I cooked dinner. I remembered the way he used to look for me in a crowd, the way his face would change when he found me. Those memories pressed up against what I had heard only hours earlier, and the contrast felt unbearable. The man I had listened to in that restaurant was not confused or overwhelmed. He was comfortable. He spoke with ease, with the assurance of someone who believed he was justified. That realization hurt more than the words themselves. It meant this was not a mistake or a careless moment. It was a choice. For years, I had explained away small absences and short conversations. I told myself that independence was healthy, that stepping back was part of being a good mother. I believed that love meant giving without conditions. Sitting there in the dark, I understood how those beliefs had slowly turned into permission. I thought about how often I had swallowed questions because I did not want to seem demanding, how often I had offered help before being asked, afraid that if I did not make myself useful, I would become invisible. I had told myself that sacrifice was noble. I had never considered that it might also be convenient for someone else. The word that kept returning to me was one I had avoided all my life. Disrespect. That was what I felt. Not just hurt feelings or disappointment, but the deeper sting of being diminished. I realized that I had been accepting less, not because I deserved it, but because I was afraid of losing what little connection remained. I considered calling Andrew right then, confronting him while the memory was still raw. I imagined his voice, calm and reassuring, offering explanations that sounded reasonable enough to quiet my doubts. I knew myself well enough to know how easily I would cling to those explanations if given the chance. So I chose not to call. That decision felt strange at first, almost wrong, like stepping out of character. But as I sat with it, the choice began to feel steady. Silence, I realized, did not have to mean surrender. It could also mean restraint. What I needed was not reassurance. I needed clarity. I needed to understand the full scope of what had been happening, not just the pieces that had slipped through when Andrew was careless. I had spent a lifetime working with numbers, tracing patterns, finding what did not belong. That skill had not disappeared just because I was older. By the time the sky outside my window began to lighten, my exhaustion had settled into something colder and more focused. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I understood that the next step would not be emotional. It would be deliberate. In the morning, I would begin protecting myself. If you're still watching and felt the weight of that decision, comment number 6 to show you're still here. Because from this point on, there is no turning back, only consequences. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. When I returned to Savannah, everything looked exactly as it always had. The brick house, the quiet street, the magnolia tree in the neighbor's yard leaning slightly to the left. Nothing about my surroundings reflected the shift that had taken place inside me. I unpacked my bag, set it by the door, and stood in the middle of the living room, aware that I was no longer the woman who had left a few days earlier. The first thing I did the next morning was make a phone call I had been putting off for years. A former colleague had once mentioned a local attorney she trusted, someone practical and thorough. I dialed the number with steady hands and asked for an appointment. I did not mention my son. I only said I needed help reviewing some financial matters. Sitting across from the attorney later that week, I focused on facts. I explained that I wanted to understand my financial exposure, nothing more. He asked me to bring whatever records I had. At home, I gathered bank statements, tax documents, and folders I had not opened since my husband passed. I spread them out on the dining room table, the same table where Andrew had once done his homework. As I sorted through the papers, I found a document I barely remembered signing. It was dated just weeks after Thomas died. I recalled Andrew sitting beside me at the kitchen counter, telling me it was routine paperwork to help with administrative matters while I was grieving. I had trusted him. I had signed without reading every page. The attorney reviewed it carefully. It was a financial authorization granting limited power to act on my behalf. He explained what that meant, how it allowed certain transactions to be made in my name. As he spoke, a familiar pressure settled in my chest. This was not vague or emotional. This was precise and binding. Together, we began tracing transactions connected to that authorization. The numbers appeared on the page in neat rows, unemotional and exact. Accounts and investments surfaced that I had never opened myself. Obligations tied to my name, not Andrew's. The attorney explained the implications calmly, outlining what responsibility would fall on me if something went wrong. I listened without interrupting. Fear tried to rise, but I pushed it down. Panic would not help me now. What mattered was understanding the scope of the situation. This was no longer about hurt feelings or strained relationships. This was about risk, liability, and my future. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel anger without shame. Not the sharp kind that demands release, but a steady resolve that clarified my thinking. I had spent my life being careful, paying my bills on time, protecting what my husband and I had built together. The idea that all of that could be compromised because I trusted my son was almost unbearable. The attorney explained that misuse of authorization could carry consequences, depending on intent and outcome. I absorbed the terminology slowly, aware that each word carried weight. This was not something that could be undone by an apology. As I drove home, the streets of Savannah felt different, narrower somehow. I understood now that doing nothing was not an option. If I stayed silent, I would be the one facing the consequences, regardless of who caused them. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table and reviewed the documents one more time. The numbers did not lie. They told a story I could no longer ignore. Love had guided me for years, but now the numbers were speaking louder, and I knew I had to listen. The days after meeting with the attorney passed quietly, but they were not peaceful. I moved through my house with a new awareness, noticing how every object carried a history of care and intention. The furniture my husband and I had chosen together, the shelves I had dusted every week for years, the folders of documents I now understood far better than I ever wanted to. Nothing felt casual anymore. I read through the notes the attorney had given me several times, not because I enjoyed it, but because clarity had become a form of grounding. Each sentence outlined a responsibility, a boundary, a possible consequence. I was no longer operating on instinct or emotion alone. I finally understood where I stood and what was at risk if I remained silent. For the first time since all of this began, I recognized that I held something I had not realized I had before. Control. Not over my son, but over my own response. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I considered what would happen if I did nothing. The answer was simple and unacceptable. I would carry the legal and financial exposure while Andrew continued on, protected by my hesitation. I also considered confronting him immediately, calling him and demanding explanations. I knew how that would end. He would deflect, reassure, soften the edges just enough to keep me uncertain. I had lived that pattern already. What I needed was structure. I decided the conversation had to happen in person, on my terms, and with purpose. This was not a moment for emotional appeals or nostalgia. It was a moment for facts. I opened my laptop and drafted a short email to Andrew. The words came slowly, each sentence chosen with care. I did not accuse him. I did not explain myself. I told him I needed to meet with him to discuss a serious financial matter and that it could not be handled over the phone. When I clicked send, my hand shook slightly, not because I doubted the decision, but because I knew what it would set in motion. Once the email was gone, there was no pretending this could be undone. I spent the next afternoon organizing the documents I would bring with me. Bank statements, authorization forms, transaction summaries. I arranged them in order, labeled and indexed, the way I would have prepared a report years ago. The familiarity of the task steadied me. This was work I understood. This was a language I spoke fluently. As I worked, I thought about Andrew differently than I ever had before, not as my child who needed protecting, but as an adult who had made deliberate choices. Loving him did not require me to shield him from consequences. In fact, I was beginning to see that doing so had only enabled what came next. I set clear boundaries for myself. I would not argue about intentions. I would not accept reassurances without action. I would not let guilt guide the conversation. My goal was accountability, not punishment. When Andrew replied later that evening and agreed to meet, the knot in my stomach tightened, but my resolve did not waver. I closed my laptop and sat quietly for a moment, aware that this was the calm before something irreversible. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be the person who looked away. If you're still here and ready to see how everything comes together, comment number 8 below. The ending is not what most people expect, but it is exactly what this story needed. Let's move on to the final chapters. The day of our meeting arrived without ceremony. We chose a quiet office near the river, neutral ground that belonged to neither of us. I arrived early and sat with my hands folded, breathing slowly, reminding myself that calm was not the same as weakness. When Andrew walked in, he looked composed, almost relaxed, as if this were another routine obligation he could manage with the right tone. I did not waste time. I laid the folder on the table between us and opened it carefully. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I presented facts, dates, amounts, authorizations. I slid each document forward in order, allowing the information to speak for itself. The room grew very quiet. At first, Andrew tried to explain. He spoke about timing, about plans to fix things later, about intentions that had been misunderstood. I did not interrupt. I let him finish, then moved to the next page. With each document, his posture shifted. The confidence drained from his face as the scope became impossible to minimize. When he realized that the liability rested with me, not him, his voice faltered. That was the moment everything changed. The conversation stopped being about justification and became about consequence. I explained calmly and clearly what would happen if these matters were not addressed. I did not threaten him. I simply described reality. There was a long silence. Andrew finally admitted what I already knew. He had used my trust as a buffer. He had convinced himself that he was protecting me from worry while protecting himself from exposure. Hearing it aloud did not hurt the way I expected. It felt final, like the closing of a door I had been holding open for years. We discussed restitution. He agreed to repay the money and correct the financial obligations tied to my name. There were practical steps to take, timelines to meet, conditions to fulfill. I stated my boundaries without negotiation. Trust, I told him, would not be restored by promises. It would require actions, sustained and verifiable. As the meeting drew to a close, I felt no sense of victory, only a quiet grief for what had been lost. The version of our relationship I once believed in no longer existed. I could not rebuild it on hope alone. Andrew stood to leave. He hesitated, as if searching for something else to say, but nothing came. He walked out without looking back. I remained seated for a moment after he was gone. The room felt emptier than before, but also lighter. When I finally stepped outside, the air off the river was cool and steady. I understood then that facing the truth always carries a cost, but so does avoiding it. This time, I had chosen myself. Life did not dramatically change after everything was settled. There were no announcements, no apologies that erased the past, no sudden sense of triumph. What changed was quieter than that. The payments were made, the accounts were corrected, the immediate danger passed. On the surface, my days returned to their familiar rhythm, but I moved through them as a different woman. The silence surprised me most. My phone no longer rang with urgency. I no longer felt that low, constant pressure to be available, to respond, to rescue. At first, the quiet felt unsettling, as if I had forgotten something important. Then I realized I had. I had forgotten myself for a very long time. I used to believe that being a good mother meant enduring anything, that love required patience without limits and understanding without accountability. I told myself that asking questions was unkind, that boundaries were a form of rejection. Those beliefs shaped my choices more than I understood at the time, and they cost me dearly. What I know now is this: love that demands silence is not love. It is erasure. When I confused sacrifice with devotion, I taught my son that my needs were optional. I did not cause his choices, but I allowed the conditions that made them possible. That realization is painful, but it is also freeing. I no longer expect my relationship with Andrew to return to what it once was. That version of us belonged to a time built on assumptions and avoidance. I grieved it, properly and fully, and then I let it go. I am not interested in recreating something that required me to shrink in order to survive. The night I stood outside that restaurant, unseen and excluded, will always stay with me, not because of the humiliation, but because it was the moment I stopped lying to myself. I saw clearly who I was to him then, and I decided who I would be to myself going forward. I am still a mother. That love does not disappear, but I am also a woman with dignity, judgment, and worth that does not depend on how needed I am by someone else. I ask questions now. I pause when something feels wrong. I trust my instincts, even when doing so is uncomfortable. If there is a lesson here, it is not about punishment or blame. It is about self-respect. Accountability is not cruelty. Boundaries are not abandonment. They are the foundation of any relationship that hopes to be honest. Facing the truth cost me an illusion. What it gave me was my voice. And that, finally, is something I will not give away again. Some endings do not arrive with noise or victory. They arrive quietly, after the hardest truths have already been faced. What remains is not bitterness, but clarity. There is a difference between love and self-erasure, between loyalty and silence, between forgiveness and permission. Growth often comes later in life, not because it is too late, but because it finally becomes necessary. When illusions fall away, dignity has room to return. Boundaries are not walls. They are lines that protect what still matters. Accountability is not punishment. It is the language of respect. And self-worth is not something granted by others, but something reclaimed from within. In the end, peace does not come from avoiding pain, but from choosing honesty over comfort and courage over fear. That choice, once made, reshapes everything that follows. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences and reflections matter. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more stories that explore truth, resilience, and self-respect.